I'm pretty sure that the recording doesn't have any of your faces or anything on it. If it does, then of course I will blur them out before I put it up. But I'm pretty sure it's just going to be recording me and my screen and my picture. But just for your comfort level, I'm going to blur that out. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today, and why are we doing this, and what is this, and all of those questions. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and screen share as I do. Okay, so what I have open on my screen right now is something that's available for all of you guys. So we are going to be going through this, but in addition, I'm going to emphasize things that are, my grading rubric or things I'm really looking for in terms of grading this week. So these, so this document here, I don't know if you guys have already found this or if you've already looked at this. I believe this is posted under your modules and under the week 2 modules. Can't remember. I think it's called Graphing Lab Student Guidelines. So this week you're not doing a full lab report. You're only doing a slim lab report, which I don't think there's a really systematic way to do the slim lab reports because sometimes they change the requirements. So my best suggestion here is look at these documents every single time or ask me if there's no document posted, like what specifically the expectations are. Because last week, remember, I told you specifically, it's the 2 plots, the 1 question that you had to answer, and the figure captions, right? I told you exactly what you needed to have. So for this week, this document is exactly what you need to have. But I think that there's some things that are a little vague here. So these kind of bold things, and I want to make sure you guys get these incorporated into your lab report. And then of course, we'll also talk about some of those questions in the lab report that were kind of like open-ended, and I didn't really give you like answers in lab. So we'll talk about those a little bit too, and maybe have a discussion, or maybe I'll just talk. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so what is a slim lab report and how am I going to be grading these? So this document, I hope you guys will look at. So laboratory notebook pages, we already talked about that. That's not really part of the slim report. That's just you're turning in your notebook pages. There are, let me see actually if I'm going to be grading those. So as far as grading your lab notebook pages, I believe I mentioned this in lab to most of you. For this week, I'm not grading quality. So if you don't think you did a good job or the answers aren't correct, don't worry this week. This is more of to get you used to turning them in. So in terms of grading for this first section here, the laboratory notebook pages, it's mostly just, did you do them? You know, I might comment if there are things that are missing. As I told people in my Thursday class, I might dock you like 0.01 point if I want to really call your attention to something, but it's like, you didn't do it wrong in terms of like your grade, but you need to do better. And I want you to learn rather than just being like, I took away 5 points for this that you never knew you had to do. So sometimes I dock really, really like almost meaningless amount of points for you to kind of be like, okay, I need to go look at what she said here. So notebook pages I will be grading, but yeah, mostly let's just kind of ease into you guys doing this for the first time. Okay, so here's the actual slim lab report. So this says 60 points. I don't know if this is up to date. 10. Yeah, it might be 50 points. It might be 60 points. If you'll notice, this says spring 2020. I think that this is just posted there from last term because my current rubric right now is 50 points. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to the point distribution here. Yeah, because it's not exactly right. Okay. So in terms of sections, so for your slim lab report, and maybe I'll even like open up a Word document so we can kind of, so I can kind of keep notes over here as we're going. Because this document might not be up the whole time. There are some other things that I'm going to be putting up on the screen in addition to this document here, right? So you're going to have your name, of course, and your section and all of the typical things that you have there. And then you're going to have a header just like you normally do, right? We'll call this one Slim Lab Report. You can maybe say what week it is for your own organization, maybe the experiment title. what was this, experiment 9, and then the title, which was what, like graphing something, whatever. You'll look that up. Okay, so make sure you have, you know, a proper title, and like your name on it. Again, emphasizing student stuff with their name on it, that's important. Especially for your lab notebooks. I don't think I remembered to emphasize this, but it's something we'll be going through and learning as we go. You need to put your partner's name in your lab notebook. I won't doc you this week because I didn't really emphasize it. It's not something we were really focused on. But if you do group work, so that part A, part B, part C, you do have to have your partner's name. Now in your lab report, you can put your partner's name here. I think for the breakout sessions, it should be the same partner every day. It won't be the same partner every session. So make sure you put your partner's name here. To be honest, this is mostly so I can make sure you're both doing unique work. Like if I have to go find who your partner was and then go compare your papers, like that's just so much work for me. So if you write it here and it seems like your plots are exactly the same, you know, that's plagiarism. So be aware of that. You are encouraged to work together or with your partner or whatever, but you cannot do the same work. You cannot submit the work. One person does the graph and both use it. That's not acceptable. Okay, blah, 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 introduction stuff. Okay, so your Slim Lab report is going to have these following sections, right? So this is in the blue bit here. So we have, they're calling it in general introduction. I'm just going to say introduction. We're going to come back to this right now. I'm just kind of making a bullet list. Okay, so introduction. Here they call this graphs. They call it graphs. I really don't like that because this looks like, you know, you've got a whole section with just graphs and no words with them. It's very strange. I don't think that they intend this to be the exact order of things. So you can call it graphs exactly like it is here in the blue section. What I think would be better, and for me starting to train you to do scientific writing, I would say results, right? That's a proper section in a journal article, right? In a scientific paper. I would say results, and normally you would say results and discussion. If you want to call your answers discussion, that's fine. You can also call them answers. Since this is a Slim lab report, this isn't exactly how we're going to do the full lab report. The full lab report is going to be more of like, you know, you're writing this science essay, right? This is a little bit more succinct of question, answer, which your full lab reports will not be. Okay, so we've got introduction, we've got results and answers. If you want, you can break those up, but I think it'll be kind of weird. I think what we should do is results and answers and have part A, part B, part C, right? Otherwise, you're going to have 3 plots for all 3 parts or multiple plots, and then you're going to have the answers, and then it's going to refer to a plot that's like way up there. That's not good, right? So where you're talking about the plots, you want that information and you want the talking about the plot next to the plot. Okay, so so far we've got introduction, results and answers. I'm combining these two, or maybe graphs. I'll say in parentheses just so we don't get confused. That's like, it's so to have a section named graphs. Okay, I'm recording this, so I gotta be positive and encouraging of all things. I gotta remember that. Okay, typed answers to questions. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then the last section, they call reflection. This, if this was an analogy for proper science writing, we would call this the discussion section or the conclusions, right? Discussion or conclusions in a proper paper. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. They give a really specific guidance for this section, which is good, but the other ones are kind of vague. Okay, so this is kind of the shell of what your lab report should kind of look like. I'm going to maybe make this italics. If you want, you can number these. That's totally fine. Maybe we'll call this 2. This will be 2A, right? This will be 2B. Actually, I don't really like, I'm going to change the formatting here. Okay, so we have, I'm going to just call this 2A. You can format this properly in Word. I'm kind of just doing this quickly so you guys can see how I would format it and what like a nice formatting organization looks of these types of either lab reports or slim lab reports. Okay, so I've got 3 sections, even though your thing here says 4. You could consider this to be results and then discussion, different sections. We're gonna do it together. So 3 sections, and then these are, subsections within there. Okay, everybody following so far? Is this pretty similar to what you had to do in Gen Chem 1 so far? Good, good. Okay, so nothing is like out of the ordinary. You guys were doing these pretty successfully. Okay, because I know some TAs were really good about giving guidance and some, maybe not. So I just want to make sure everybody's got a good, at least foundation. Should we make an Excel version of the part A graph? No, you don't have to. I mean, if you want to, you can, but that's not really necessary. You're going to be giving me the the lab notebook pages. What you really can do is you're gonna already have pictures of those. You can just put in, the picture here. There's no need to do like extra work or anything. Okay, so that's like a good outline of what you can expect for that. So let's actually go back and now talk about the introduction. So as far as introduction, it's not where we're focusing on the majority of the points this week, but I do want you to start focusing on how to write a good introduction for both a slim lab report and a full lab report. I'd say your primary focus for the points of this slim lab report are the graphs. And specifically, I'm just gonna put this over, no, we're gonna leave it there. Specifically for the graphs, I'm gonna actually read this part because I think it's important for you guys to know where our focus is for the week. It says, be strict for this section. They need to learn what's acceptable ASAP. This is the best opportunity. I really agree with that, right? So we're going to kind of pick a section to focus on each week, really hammer it. And then next week, I'm barely going to talk about graphs, but I'm going to grade just as strict as I am this week, right? And so slowly, we're going to focus on each section every single week. And at the end of the term, you're going to be perfect on all of the sections by focusing on one at a time. And then eventually when you're in organic chemistry, I don't think they do reports, which is kind of crazy. But in physical chemistry, you do reports, full lab reports for every single experiment. And they're expected to be top quality, right? So by the end of general chemistry, you should be like, I got this, Okay, so for your introduction, it says, introductory comments on why graphing skills are important, what features of a graph should be considered, what makes a good graph. No. I think, in my opinion, like we're going to be talking in the answers in the discussion area about all of that. I think this is hard for me to teach, right? Because like I want to teach you how to do proper writing, which proper writing in an introduction, you wouldn't be like, we learned graphing skills. Like what you learned about was, like yes, extrapolation, interpolation, but like what was the science? What was the chemistry, right? I want to teach you about being a chemist, not this isn't a computer science class, right? Like I took a computer science class in like high school or whatever, and we learned about graphing. And so what I'd rather us focus on is the chemistry of it. If you follow this exactly, that's fine. But what I would think you want to do for your introduction is more of, an introduction in terms of like, what is the chemistry we studied? And so there's the part A, which is really disconnected from part B and C, right? Part A was really just a graphing exercise. But we did do some chemistry. We did study the relationship between Fahrenheit and Celsius. So you can talk about that. I think if you just answer this question, that's totally fine. But it just doesn't feel like chemistry level quality writing. Let me think about that. So let's like read the rest of this paragraph, and then we'll formulate what a good introduction would look like for this lab. Include class beginning questions and individual beginning questions. I'm gonna disagree with that also, only for the fact that like I don't ever want to see a question from your writing. Like sometimes like in lower level like writing classes, you know, it will be some kind of device to be like, use a question and then immediately answer it or something. I want you guys to be able to start writing immediately from a science perspective, right? Which is very concise, very factual, very statement based. So instead of like, what will happen when we measure Celsius and Fahrenheit? What will the relationship be? You shouldn't say that. What you should say is what the introduction material is, right? Which is um, materials can be, you know, their temperature can be measured in a laboratory setting. It can be measured using Celsius or Fahrenheit, which are different units. You know, it's like you're giving me information. You're not asking me questions in your lab report. You're teaching me. You should use this lab report to demonstrate to me what you've learned and pretend you're teaching me. I think the best way to go about these lab reports is use your active voice, not passive voice. Use your active voice to teach me the science of this lab. That is your best approach to this introduction. So in terms of like including your beginning questions, I would prefer you don't. Since this is in the recommendations here, I'm not going to mark you down if they're there. I will definitely red ink all over it because I just don't feel like that's what I want to see from your writing. Also include a brief description of the procedure. I also don't want this. So if this was a full lab report, there would be another section here, and it would be experimental. Now, in a full lab report, we can include this since it says this, but honestly, I want your introduction to be focused on science. And since this rubric doesn't include doesn't include an experimental section, I don't think it's super good to teach you guys that the procedure goes into the introduction. That is not where it goes. You should not in the introduction give a procedure. That is for a section called experimental. In the experimental section of a paper, you want to give all of the details so another scientist can reproduce your work. I do that with my, you know, publication quality research, all of that. So I wouldn't worry about that because we're not doing a full lab report this week. What you do need to describe though, maybe I'll highlight this one bit. Include a brief description, yes. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail once we start formulating the intro. Where's my highlighter? So not of the procedure, but a brief description of what you did. So you should say something along the lines of, you know, in this experiment, we used, you know, desktop Bunsen burners to heat water to measure the relationship between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Now you told me a brief description of the experiment, which is appropriate in the introduction, but you're not giving me a procedure. It's kind of the nuance, right? It's a dance. And as we learn full lab reports, you'll understand that nuance. In the introduction, you want to tell people the big picture, science, like who cares about this? Why do people care about it? You want to then tell them the more detailed about like, you know, your direct application. Why are you studying this and why do you care? So big picture, why does everybody reading this care? Narrow it down to what are you caring about and what's the specific science you're looking at? And then you want to give them some ideas of like, oh, I used this type of technique. So other scientists that are reading your paper will be like, oh, they used infrared spectroscopy. Also, I use infrared spectroscopy. If I keep reading their paper, I'm going to see data that I understand. Or maybe you'll say, oh, they used, you know, thermodynamic equations. Oh, my research is thermodynamic equations. I want to keep reading this, right? So your introduction should kind of, you want to bait people into reading the rest of your paper. So you want us to submit everything in our from our lab notebook as well as create a type slim report. Yes. Which will have a bit of an overlap. Yes, they will have an overlap. There will always be an overlap. Your typed either slim lab report or full reports will have so much of the exact information in your notebook. That's going to be typical, and that is proper. That should be expected. Okay, appropriately captioned data tables and observations. No, this also does not belong in the introduction. If your TA discusses specific details about graphs that are helpful, include those comments. No, also, I don't want to see that. So what is, so I think I just read this whole thing and said no to it. So what's a good introduction if everything in here I just said no to? So maybe I'll just start by, let me actually, I don't want this to be, maybe I'll just start by pointing out what I just said, right? Your introduction should have several different points here, which is your big picture, introduction, intro sentence, I'll say, sentences. For your case, one sentence is fine, or maybe two sentences, because this particular lab, the part A, part B, part C, they're so like all over the place. B and C definitely have to do with each other, right? Fossil fuels and carbon emissions, but part A, it's just a graphing exercise. So that might be something you want to say twice. Your big picture, you could also say something about this like graphing thing, right? Of like, and again, you want to use a kind of, you never want to use the word I. Maybe I should make like a don't do this because I don't like it list in addition to what you should do. Okay, so the red stuff is do not. Do no, do no, do no, do not use the word I ever. Okay. I'm sure there'll be more there. So this should not be I made a graph. I learned about, this is always like professional level writing of, you know, if you want your first sentence to be about graphing, you could say something along the lines of scientists, researchers, whatever you want to say there. Scientists use tabular or graphical representations of data in every instance, let's say, right? That's a sentence that gives you an idea, okay, what is the rest of this paper going to be about? But it's the biggest picture possible, right? So that big picture intro sentence of the rest of this paper is going to focus on graphing and the importance of extrapolation, interpolation, blah, 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 all the things we talked about. But addressing it from a standpoint of you, my reader, why are you reading this? Well, the reason you're reading this is because all scientists have to use graphical or tabular, you know, representations of their data to, you know, communicate science. So that's okay to say something like that, right? And so after the big picture, then you want to kind of go narrow, right? Narrow it in on your specific focus, right? So I'm going to actually pull up an example now before we get too far. So not that one. This is a paper from a coworker of mine. This is, you don't have to understand any of this. I just want to use this as an example of what I'm teaching you in this idea of the introduction and experimental section, what I just mentioned, right? These are proper sections of a professional level paper. This is not just teaching you for the sake of, you know, a homework assignment. And so in her introduction, so we do a reaction for your information. So we do a reaction called water splitting. It's pretty cool. You take water, you take energy from the sun, a chemical catalyst to make the reaction go faster. You take the water, you split it in half. Then you're left with hydrogen and oxygen, and you can use the hydrogen for hydrogen fuel. Huge applications, hydrogen fuels, batteries, catalysis. So many different people are reading these papers, right? And so what her very first sentence is not her research. Her first sentence is, hey, you out there in the solar energy field, right? Her very first sentence is solar or electrically driven water electrolysis, water splitting, for the production of hydrogen fuel is a promising renewable energy storage technology. That is the biggest picture sentence of the very nuanced work that we do. Like the work she does, it's like this nuanced, like it is a fraction of the science that's being done in the field. but you start at that big picture and you start narrowing down, right? So for a professional paper, she would have like a whole paragraph of kind of a big picture. Next paragraph, but for you guys, just a sentence, is now focus it down. Her next sentence, first sentence in the next paragraph is, we have identified this catalyst, this one, right? The one she's presenting, as the most active OER, oxygen evolution, oxygen splitting catalyst in alkaline medium, very specifically. Yes, sorry you have to go. That's totally fine. I'm not going to post it on Canvas because I've got 3 different sections and I'd have to somehow figure out how to post it to all 3. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this to a YouTube and I'm going to share the YouTube link because I feel like that's the easiest way for me to share it with everybody, not just one of Canvas page or something. I don't know how that's going to work. I'm going to give that a try. Okay, so you can already see these examples of what I'm talking about with about big picture and then narrow it into specific, right? She's talking about solar energy, and then she narrows down to, okay, we have this one single catalyst we're looking at for half of the reaction in a very specific solution, right? So big picture, then narrow it down to what you're looking at. From there, okay, so then we're going to go further down and she's talking really specifically. You can give the implications, right? So now, again, this is a fishing expedition, right? You're trying to get people to keep reading your paper. Science communication is about being persuasive and being concise, giving information, but doing it in a way where people actually want to read it, right? If you say, I learned about graphing, your first sentence, I'm going to be like, ugh. But if you give me a sentence that's like, scientists across the world use graphs every day to communicate their science to other researchers, I'm going to be like, go on. You know, and that's the kind of writing you want to think about doing. I know that's kind of like a hokey emphasis, but it really is true. I don't want to hear I learned graphing. I want to hear the drama, the science, right? Okay. So after we get the big picture and then after we narrow it down, you get the implications. This is now you got people on the hook. They're like, oh, okay, I work in solar energy. Oh, okay, they're working on that catalyst. And now you talk about the implications, right? And so here in our introduction, so big picture, I'm going to maybe start using some actual examples. Big picture, right? Scientists use graphs. Now, I'm purposely using very bad sentences and trying to say as little as I can because I don't want you guys just writing what I write, right? I'm trying to get you ideas of where you can go with this. Scientists use graphs, okay? Narrow it in, specific focus, right? So what did we do in this lab? What did we didn't just graph, right? We learned about transforming axes and like why you would do that. What does that even mean? Right. So maybe, let's see. So we learned about that. We also learned about different fits. Interpolation, extrapolation were big parts of this lab, right? Especially that one really important question of, what are I think I said it in Thursday's lab. What are the dangers of extrapolation? Just because it looks like a good fit and your R² number is great, can you just safely extrapolate outside of the data set? Why or why not? I want you all to Google the dangers of extrapolation. It's very dramatic, I know, but it is dramatic and it should be. So Google it. I promise you, you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. How can I know what happened before or after if I don't know every single factor and I can't model every single factor? So for you're narrowing it down, you could say things along the lines of, how do I say this without saying it? So a sentence or two about, not tools, that's not the right word. Maybe like transforming for linear fitting. Maybe we also talked about, you could have an extra sentence here, maybe a sentence or two, maybe I'll just say sentences. Right? You don't want it to be a run-on, but you want to make sure you capture everything that this lab report is going to be about. Transforming and linear fitting, interpolation, extrapolation, R squared values. Now you don't have to say all of this stuff. I'm just giving you ideas of things that you could say in a couple sentences. You could say, you know, narrowing it down, understanding how properly to extrapolate data and when it's appropriate is a valuable skill for scientists, right? You don't want to use statements like if they do this, then this. You don't want to use like if thens in scientific paper, but you want to point out that using these tools using these tools in an inappropriate way, extrapolating when that's not appropriate, will give you the wrong data, will give you the wrong answer, right? So you might want to say that for your implications, right? So this could have a big big relationship. Whoops. To the question in lab, the dangers of extrapolation. What else? So beginning questions, yeah, not really. Okay, so that kind of covers the big picture, narrow it in down, give the implications. Why is this important? Why am I reading your paper? Like, fine, I know that, you know, solar energy is important. Fine, I know that you're studying this catalyst, but like, what's the implications? So those implications could be this, right? And then the next thing you want to do is that brief description thing, right? A lot of times you'll see in papers, we have previously, one way to better understand. So here's some implications. A challenge, so more implications, right? Why is this work important? Well, because part of the challenge she's solving in this paper here. Studies here. You see this word a lot in introductions in the first, you know, towards the end of an introduction. This is now the description of experiment, not the procedure, right? So you'll say here, right? Or something like that. You say, you know, in this experiment, that's also acceptable. Here in this experiment, not what I did, not I did an experiment, right? Okay, so you've got here, you could say we, I, sort of, that's sort of acceptable here, but here, if you want to avoid the I and the we, you can say the, let me see, I don't want to type the exact sentence. So here, you know, you can say 3 different graphing exercises were used to what? Demonstrate these things, right? Fill in your sentences. I'm going to let you finish those sentences, right? So now what do we have here? I've got one sentence that we've been talking about for our big picture. We've got one sentence about narrow it in less specific focus, right? We're talking about graphs. Well, specifically, we learned about interpolation, extrapolation, R squared, whatever those sentences you want to work out there. Then what are the implications? Why do we care? The dangers of extrapolation. And then finally, the description of the experiment, which then will gently lead the reader into here we use these graphing techniques, right? If this was a proper full lab report, your next section is then experimental. And what's beautiful about ending with that description experiment, and when you say here, we used this technique to study this thing, your next paragraph in your next section is now experimental, which is just this beautiful transition of, now let me give you all the hard details. I just told you in a really nice way, I'm going to use graphing for this. And now experimental, you'd say, I used Excel version 2016. We used this, you know, luckily this is not, you know, you don't have to do the experimental section. Okay, so that's kind of my rundown of what I want to see for your intro sections, which I think is quite a bit different from what these kind of guidelines say. I mean, honestly, if you give me exactly what these guidelines say, I'm just going to try to help you make it better. I won't grade you poorly if you include your beginning questions, because I can't, it's in here, but I will grade you better if it doesn't have the beginning questions. Am I allowed to say that? I don't know. Don't share this YouTube with anyone. Okay, so the next section here, you have graphs and answers. I want this section to be a combination of both of these blue sections here. Because it doesn't make sense to separate them essentially. So what I want to see is specifically, let me actually get my Excel plot so I can copy and paste here. I'm just going to grab some quick snips so I can adjust them real quick. You want to put your actual plots in there probably. If you use screenshots and not your actual plots, I actually don't mind. I think that the instructors of this course are like, no screenshots. For this level, I'm okay with screenshots. I think they're actually easier to work with in your Word documents. Just make sure they're not like fuzzy and bad looking. Okay, so here's my plot. I'm going to pretend this is hand drawn because I didn't do it hand drawn. I did mine in Excel, right? And so for part A, before you just stick a plot in there, you have to have some words, right? Science writing is going to feel very redundant to you. So part A, you're going to have some words transitioning into this section. Okay, it's hard to talk and type at the same time. Transitioning into this section by giving a brief sentence or two of the experiment. So here you're just going to kind of reiterate, be like, you know, and you don't want to say I did or in this section. Definitely do not say in part A, we made a graph. Don't want that, right? We want it to be not passive. We want it to be this a really strong, active third person. And so what did we do? So in this experiment, we took a bait beaker and we boiled it and we measured the temperature. So here you can say a beaker of water, right? So you're going to start like that, a beaker of water. What happened to it? Or what did we do? What, right? I'm going to just leave it like this because I don't want to type it word for word. So, right, you'd say like a beaker of water was heated or, you know, something like that. In science writing, something always happens magically to inanimate objects. A beaker was heated. It's not, I heated a beaker, right? It's a beaker was heated. Why? I don't know. It's just how just how it's done, right? So a beaker of water was heated until boiling, right? Until boiling, blah, blah, blah. You're going to have some really nice sentences here. Temperature measurements, right? And you're going to specifically say, don't forget your units. So when you say temperature measurements were taken after, you know, in the start, and then, you know, after adding ice and all of that, make sure whenever you say that, you say, you know, in Celsius and Fahrenheit, and you want to use your little symbols, right? Up here, insert symbols. Want to make sure if you're using degrees, you actually properly use degrees and not like an asterisk or something. Okay, so you're going to give a couple sentences giving yet again a description, but a little bit more, you know, in detail than we did here, because here we just kind of said it very generally about all three parts. And now this is where we're going to say it in a little bit more detail without giving so much detail. It's an experimental section. Okay, so then you're going to have your plot. What goes right underneath the plot? Right? A really nice figure caption. A good description of the figure. Make sure you include the legend information in here. Data is fit to a linear equation, if it is, or whatever it is in your case, right? Red line. Okay. Now, one other thing I want you to do in here is, after you describe how the data was collected, i.e., ice was added and temperature measurements collected, blah, 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 right? After you say that, at the end of that sentence, I want you to then put figure 1. This is another really important thing that I want you guys to do and that I want to emphasize. And I am going to be emphasizing this week because this is the graphs and figure week. If you talk about it in the paragraph, you need to reference it the first time. The first time you ever talk about the data or the plot, or you're referring to the plot, you have to say it in the paragraph area. This is where it gets redundant, right? Here, you're literally describing the plot because you're talking about it. Then you've got your plot, right? And your caption. I'm gonna put a little box around this just so it's really clear that this is the, okay, then you've got your figure. Then you're gonna describe the figure again. Yes, it was in the description. Now you're going to say it again, but now you're being more descriptive about the actual data, right? Like, what are the blue dots? What is the red line? What do they mean, right? So you're going to say it there. Now, below your figure, this is where you can do your, this section here, the answers to the questions. So there are a number of probing questions, which means you need to think about these and include the answers where needed. Specific questions embedded in the description of descriptions of each lab of this part. I'm pretty sure I emphasized this pretty strongly while we were in lab. My rubrics specifically assign points to did the student answer this question, right? And it's all those questions that I was like highlighting and pointing out in lab that are like snuck into those paragraphs where, one of them was like, what are the independent and dependent variables, right? We talked about that, but I don't think it was a direct question. It was in the paragraph. So down here, this is where you're going to be able to answer all those questions. I encourage you to do it in paragraph form. So here, you're going to not just say what is the independent and dependent, variable, and then here's your answer. I encourage you not to do it that way, to start practicing fully writing these things out. If you do it this way for this week, since this is a slim lab report, that's totally fine as well. Whatever your preference is for this week, just know that when we move to full lab reports, there will not be any, here was the question, here was the answer. Here's the question, here's the answer. There won't be any of that. So in this section here, you're going to answer all those questions that we made sure you answered in your lab notebook. I can't go through each one because then it would be basically me giving you the rubric, and I'm not allowed to do that. So make sure you put everything in here. Is that clear? So that kind of covers everything you're supposed to put in like part A, and then you need to duplicate that, right, for part B and C, where you have a short intro paragraph. Describing what follows and referencing the plot that you're going to put in, right? Then, of course, you're going to have your plot, right? We'll just put this one in there again, just as a placeholder. Have your plot again, and then have your figure, right? This kind of structure, I know, seems like nitpicky. If you don't do it this way, I'm not going to mark you off, but you're going to get a better grade if you do it this way. Does that make sense? Like that was saying the same thing. Okay, so short part B, short paragraph describing what's going to follow, just like we did in A, your plot, and then answer those questions. And then part C, likewise, you're going to go through that again. And I want to talk about reflection section quick, and then we can go back to any specific questions that you guys have about how to answer some of those questions in the lab notebook. We might go all the way to 7 tonight rather than 6:50. If you guys need to leave, that's totally okay. But yeah, I just want to make sure this first time we do this, you guys get as much information as possible. Okay. So guidelines for writing short answers. I'm not going to read this to you. You can read this if you'd like. I don't even know if I agree with everything in here. I would say your best approach is to answer things with those full paragraphs, right? If it says what's the independent, dependent, it's pretty easy to make a sentence out of that. So I'm gonna let you guys read all of this part. So the reflection section is kind of your conclusion. It's very bold. It's very capital letters screaming at you. There's a lot here. It's a pretty good chunk of points. It's not the majority this week. The majority is the figures and plots and figure captions and formatting and putting them into the document properly. But this is a good chunk of points. And I think this is just like they want you to like, I don't know, process chemistry and think about the real world. So I'm also not going to go through this line by line because this description is almost verbatim what my rubric says. Yeah. So if you want, you can even number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm fine with that. This is kind of an extra section that's more like a homework assignment than it is part of your lab report. My suggestion for a lot of these things, maybe not that one, but like propose ideas for further experiments. On this one, this is tough, especially like today we did a graphing exercise. So maybe you can focus a little bit more on the CO2, further experiments. So always in scientific papers. So I'm going to pull open my coworker's paper again, and I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom where she's got conclusions, right? This is very typical. So conclusions, normally not for your SLIM lab report, you restate what you did yet again. Science writing, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. That's always how you do it in science writing. And so you studied this thing. And in here, there probably is, her conclusion is pretty short, but somewhere in here, if I looked long enough, there would be some comments from her about what this paper didn't answer, and kind of the holes that are open. I won't spend time looking for it in that particular paper, but that's kind of what this part is teaching you to do. The extend is, if this was really an experiment you did in your lab, science is never done. It's not like I did the experiment, done, science is over. In my job, when I write a paper, I'm not saying to the world, science is done, guys. I finished it. I figured out catalysis. I can split water. I'm done. What it is it's baby steps, always baby steps, right? It's like we had a question. We asked the question and then we did experiments to try to answer the question. Here's the answers we discovered. And that's where we are today. There's still a lot more questions. And so think to yourself, okay, if I was going to do further experiments, if I was a scientist studying CO2, what else could I do? Maybe you would measure local CO2 absorption. Maybe you would be suggesting things like, oh, you would do the same experiment, but do it regional, right? To see what regional factors are coming into play when you're talking about CO2 dissolving into water, right? Does salt water absorb CO2 differently than lake and ocean water, right? So maybe that's something you would do experiments about of, we learned about CO2 and dissolving into water, or maybe it would be more like the oxygen in the air, right? Of, what other things can you experiment with that? What would be further experiments with oxygen? I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but you can Google, you can always Google too, of something that might be helpful in this type of situation. Oh, whoops. For pretty much everything in the reflection section, except for like, how does this relate to your lecture? Applications, same thing. So extend, applications, related reading, green chemistry, all this stuff you're going to want to Google and use proper references, right? You guys got taught proper reference making in Gen Chem 1, right? Did you or no? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, cool. So, if I was going to try to figure out an extend here, maybe I would even just Google, research ocean right? And maybe just start looking like, well, I don't know, what are people doing? And this should only take you like 5-10 minutes, right? Just to kind of get an idea. I wouldn't go too heavy into scientific journal articles because that's going to take you a long time to read. But maybe you can look at, okay, NASA's saying something about oceans carbon balance, what's happening to the oceans. Maybe just like pop a few of these open, just kind of skim around to see, you know, okay, what are they talking about here? The measured ocean. Here's a experiment showing CO2 in the water based on temperature. Maybe that's something that you can suggest as an idea, right? Because global warming and CO2, as the temperature in you know, our globe or in our entire world is increasing, how does that change the acidification of our oceans, right? This is totally valid. Just because someone's doing it doesn't mean for your general chemistry level thing, you don't have to put it in there. So that would be a perfectly valid extend that you could put in there. What else? But you see, that only took me like 5 minutes. I found something that was related. That is something that you can write about that would extend more experiments. So likewise, real world applications. In this one, it should be pretty obvious, right? Because we're talking about greenhouse gases and global warming. So you can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so related reading, identify recent principles in green chemistry and briefly how they were implemented and added to this experiment. Have you guys been, you've been learning about green chemistry? Okay, maybe, I mean, I'll have to like touch base with your professor on that to see how they're changing general chemistry labs to make them green, basically make them, you know, less toxic and more sustainable. I don't have enough intuition about chemistry curriculum to have insight for you during this session, but maybe I'll talk to Professor Greenbow about what kind of things they're looking for in this section, or I encourage you to talk to him as well. But I'm going to say for right now, I don't have a lot to add to this because I don't, you know, I'm kind of new to teaching with this little section in there. So,
last term, in our lab manual, there's at the beginning, there's an outline of like 12 green chemistry principles. And my TA just had us talk about which ones that the experiment, when we were doing like more laboratory experiments,
I see. Okay.
how each of those were
Open.
included in our experiment.
Okay. Well, then that's good. So your lab manual has green chemistry principles. I thought I had that PDF open, but I don't think I do. So, yeah, so I guess use that. Whoops. Use that. That's not something I'm super familiar with. And to be honest, from my perspective, trying to teach you to be a good science writer, whatever, just do your best there. Okay, so we're coming close to the end. I'll save a little bit of time to ask you guys, is there anything you foresee you're going to have trouble answering or responding to? I know there were some tough questions in there, but I'm confident with enough thought with it outside of lab that you guys can answer pretty much all of those, but I'm open to addressing any of them in particular. No? Okay.
I had a question
Yeah.
about citing our sources.
Yeah.
Do you care, like, do you have a preference on which style citation, like MLA or APA?
No, I don't. Just use whatever your preference is and be consistent. So in the same document, you shouldn't be switching to like, you know, numbered and named. I don't have a preference in different journal articles that you will write for someday as a scientist. Every journal might have different standards. So I'd say just pick one and be consistent. I don't know if there's a standard for this class as a whole, but I'm the only one grading your reports. So for me, I don't mind, but it does have to be a proper citation, which I think there are guidelines about that. I'm not going to go through that today. If I see that a lot of people are doing poor citations, then I will go over it in future discussion sessions. I won't be grading it terribly difficult. You do have to have citations, but that wasn't the focus of today's discussion session. Today, I really wanted to focus on the structure of your lab reports and writing them properly, even if they're slim, right? Like, how do you do a results section? You're going to do a little short paragraph. You got to put a picture and you got to have a figure caption. You know, what is an introduction? What are the parts of it? So today I really wanted to focus on how I want stylistically and organization your guys' reports to look like. And I wanted to focus mostly on, structuring those figures. So yes, you always have to have citations. Yes, they need to be done properly. That's not going to be a heavily graded point this week. Good question. Anything else? Awesome. I think I promised somebody that we could go over like RAQs or LAQs. Just go ahead and send me an email. These sessions are not meant to be extended office hours. Sometimes if there's extra time, I will answer office hour questions, but I do have the 2 traditional office hours for those. And I'm also pretty responsive by email. So please feel free to reach me there if you have any other questions, or if you want any clarification to anything I said here. I hopefully am still recording this, and did this get recorded? I hope so. Yeah. Yeah. So I'll upload this somewhere and distribute it as soon as I can. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming by, guys. I am hoping that this was helpful, and I'm hoping that you got some probably not new information. I'm hoping that you heard this before in your Gen Chem class, but hopefully information, heard again and again will make you perfect, excellent, science writers. So if there's nothing else, you can go away.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
You're welcome.